Hi all. As the message said, I was considering not giving this talk, but Katya, I guess, and Shakir talked to me about it, and we hope that something positive comes out of this. I hope that something positive comes out of what happened to me at Google. So I thought that I would talk about what I would like those things to be in this talk. So I'm calling it Beyond the Fairness, Rhetoric, and Machine Learning. And I guess my most recent claim to fame is that I was fired from Google, and my name is Timnit Gebru. So I'm going to first really quickly do a recap of what happened to me. On December 2nd, I was supposedly in the middle of a 2-week vacation, and I was taking a break from driving across the country. So I had written a paper which one day before I went for vacation was told that I needed to retract, and this happened with zero conversation or justification. Then my co-lead, Meg, objected to the fact that you just can't tell people to retract a paper with no justification. So then she was told that after we retract a paper, Sammy, our manager, would be allowed to read us a 1-page document about the justification. And so after a bunch of back and forth on December 1st, I wrote an email that ended with, it said, I hope you have a good week, and as I mentioned, I will neither answer email nor do anything else with respect to this until I'm back from my vacation on Monday. So then during my vacation at night, I got a message from Nagar, who was reporting to me at the time about, we were just chatting about some stuff that she found interesting, and then immediately after, she was like, you resigned? Megan sent me an email. And I was like, saying what? She said, she told me she accepted your resignation. Can I call? Can we talk? Can you please join the link? Did you give the resignation letter? I'm like, nope. She's like, right now? They're doing this tonight while you're on vacation? I can't believe this is happening. Hey. So she's really freaking out trying to reach me. And I was like, okay, one sec. I'm gonna talk to Sammy. I'll talk to you. So I call him. He also didn't know what was going on. But then I find that there was an email to my personal email address with the title, accepting your resignation. My manager was CC'd, but he had no idea what this was happening. He was not consulted. But of course, Jeff Dean, and was one of the most respected researchers here, even in this community, was consulted and aware. And so the next day, Jeff emailed a statement to all of Google Research, and an extent of which is online. So it starts with, I understand the concern over Timnit Gebru's resignation from Google, and I think at this point it's probably needless to say that I never resigned. It talks about how we had a paper that was approved without review, so Sammy was the one who approved a paper with review, and he's approved many papers. It says the paper needed 2 weeks for review, which obviously is false, and the publication approver, which is Sammy, should have known that if that was the case. Says that the paper misses citations, talks about problems without solutions, etc. So basically it publicly disparages my work and my collaborators' work. And then it says, I also feel badly that hundreds of you received an email just this week from Timnit telling you to stop working on critical DI programs. As someone who spends more time than literally everyone else working on quote-unquote critical DI programs, this was just a ridiculous thing to see. So I'm neither the first nor the only nor the last person who's been and will be subjected to this. And so in my talk, I want to do 3 things. First thing I want to do is give examples of other people who've been subjected to this type of retaliation when they work on machine learning fairness. Second one is I want to discuss components of our paper that we were told to retract, and sort of connect some things that happened to me at Google with some of the stuff that we talk about in our paper, and just give examples to make the points that our paper was trying to make. And third, I want to close by talking about what I think the research community should do and advocate for. So let me start with number 1. There's many groups of people. I had another version of this talk that was way longer, and I talked about a number of people, but here I'm going to focus on Deborah Raji, Joybul Amini, and later I'll talk about Meg Mitchell. So Joybul Amini is founder of the Algorithmic Justice League, and she led a groundbreaking paper called Gender Shades, which showed high disparities in error rates in automated facial analysis tools between darker-skinned women and lighter-skinned men especially. And so her and Deb Raji, shown here, wrote a follow-up paper called Actionable Auditing. And actionable auditing showed that Amazon's recognition tool could probably show similar biases to that shown in gender shades. And Amazon was selling the recognition tool to law enforcement. And of course, most recently, we see that there are people who were wrongfully arrested by a facial algorithm model that wrongfully identified them as somebody else. And, obviously Joy is very intimately aware of that. She writes about Robert Williams, how he was wrongly arrested in Detroit. So, nevertheless, whether or not there are these disparities in error rates, a lot of people have also been organizing against surveillance in their homes. So here you see Trenae Morin and others in the Brooklyn residents who were organizing against their landlords installing facial surveillance in their homes. And nevertheless, Amazon, with all these issues, was selling recognition, their tool, to law enforcement. And when this paper came out, Actionable Auditing, what did they do? They tried to discredit Joy and Deb, same as how Google is trying to discredit me. So they said a bunch of things. The research paper in question does not use the recommended facial recognition capabilities, does not share the confidence level used in their research, and we have not been able to reproduce the results of the study. We have not had any reported law enforcement misuses of Amazon recognition. These groups have refused to make their training data and testing parameters publicly available, which is ridiculous because their training data has been replicated by many different other groups. So what did we do? Meg and I, we assembled a bunch of researchers, and we spent one whole month working on a point-by-point rebuttal to come to their defense. And this was covered by a bunch of news articles, and so they weren't able to do this to them anymore. So they weren't able to get away with what they were trying to discredit these two women. Now, what happened afterwards? National Science Foundation and Amazon created this fairness initiative, and they announced some funds. When I look at the people who won these funds, there was not a single Black person who received this grant. And it was very, very clear that this fairness initiative was created in response to Deb and Joy's paper. So this happened because of their paper, and what did they get out of it? They were publicly disparaged, and other people, marginalized groups, had to come to their defense. Other people didn't come to their defense. And then this company, after doing this to them, creates an initiative in response to their work, did not make amends for the harm they caused to them, nor did they acknowledge their work. And so they were harmed, but others benefited from their work. And this is not fairness. This is exploitation. So in May 2025, George Floyd was murdered, and this set off worldwide Black Lives Matter protests. And so at Google, of course, I co-organized a presentation where we were emotional. We were trying to talk about, the issues in the research organization, potential ways forward, etc. And they made racial commitments. And I mean, we can see how well they followed through on their commitments. But around the same time, IBM announced that they were abandoning selling facial recognition tools. Microsoft said they're not going to sell any tools to law enforcement until federal regulation. And Amazon announced a one-year moratorium of selling it to law enforcement. But they still did not acknowledge nor cite the works of Deb and Joy, whom they publicly tried to discredit. The other person I want to talk about is Meg Mitchell, who was my co-lead at Google. So after I got fired, Meg internally advocated for justice. She even wrote a potential apology email for Jeff Dean. She was emailing them day in and day out, telling them how damaging this was and how what they did to me tied to their overall ethics initiative. So she finally sent an email to leadership and Google PR, a 3-page document sharing her concerns about my firing. She detailed our work together, my work, and how what they were doing was not okay. The same day, her corporate access was cut off. She was interrogated and intimidated over 5 weeks. She was fired, once again, without input or knowledge from her manager, Sammy, and she was subsequently smeared by Google. And Sammy, of course, I think people know at this point, resigned from Google. So many people write papers, post niceties on social media, and congratulate each other for being, the good ones. But few continue to take the fall, and the fall is serious. And I want to make it clear that it is not a game. It's not a game. I have been afraid for my life. I have been afraid for other people's lives. Members of the ethical AI team have been afraid for their lives. And so I'm neither the first nor the only one nor the last to have been subjected to this. And this is a playbook that's used against whistleblowers, that's used against many others. And so thankfully, Caitlin Turner, Dr. Caitlin Turner, Professor Danielle Wood, and Professor Catherine DiGiamazio wrote about this playbook, putting into context what was done to me. So here's the playbook. They call it the Abuse and Misogyneer playbook. Misogyneer, if you look at the bottom, is a term coined by Dr. Moya Bailey in 2010, describes the particular form of anti-Black racism, anti-Black sexism faced by Black women. And I've faced a lot of it in my career. So this is the playbook. Step one, there's a contribution, the taboo contribution, and the master's tools. So historically, Black women are not supposed to, they're supposed to shut up and put up. They're not supposed to question anything. They're supposed to observe and completely take note of all details, but say nothing. So this is the U.S., but there's many other countries where this was also the case. So somebody makes a contribution. A Black woman makes a contribution using the master's tools. So in this case, we used a research paper. Step two, there is disbelief and the devaluating of Black women's creations. So rather than accept the truth that an institution may be perpetuating harm, people can accept that one that says that an individual like me is mistaken or unwell, and that is what led to this errant, wrong contribution. So then this public is primed now for the subsequent gaslighting and discrediting. The steps 3 to 5 are dismissal, erasure, and revisionism. So erasure aims to delete the original contribution, silence the contributor, and stigmatize her so that she does not gain a platform or respect elsewhere. And let me tell you, I knew this was happening, so I was trying to continue to raise my voice about what exactly happened so that I wouldn't be stigmatized. So there were many things that they said to try to discredit and dismiss us, right? The first one being the authors were informed that it did not meet our bar for publication, that we were given feedback about why, and like I said, we weren't initially at all until Meg kind of objected. Again, dismissal, erasure, revisionism. I obviously was dismissed, fired. Justine was working on a paper aiming to discredit ours after he fired me. And those who reviewed the paper for approval internally were the same people who worked on ordering us to retract our paper. And then they released the paper without, citing us, even though we know it was entirely inspired by our paper, and they definitely had our paper in mind a lot when they were writing it. And so Kari Johnson says, this sounds like step 4 of the misogyneer playbook. So what is the responsibility of conferences like ICLR when they have submissions like this that have clear conflicts of interest from industry? So we'll talk about that later. That's in number 3. The second one thing I want to do is discuss components of the paper that we worked on and show how my own life and what happened to me at and after Google were examples of some of the things we discussed in our paper. So the paper is called On the Dangers of Stochastic Parrots Can Language Models Be Too Big? And let me tell you, we had no idea that this was going to happen when we wrote this paper. We just thought we were going to write a paper and that was it and move on. We didn't think it was going to be a paper that was really controversial. We didn't think it was a paper that was even going to make waves. We just thought it was a paper. So the paper had 7 authors, and Mark Diaz, Vinod, Ben, and Meg were not allowed to have their names on the paper because by the time we published it, they were still at Google. And Meg, of course, was subsequently fired. And I was fired, so I still had my name on the paper. So we touch on a lot of points in this paper, but I want to talk about a couple of points and give examples to show some of those points and how intricately kind of related they are. So we talk about environmental and financial costs, and we say when we perform the risk-benefit analysis of large language models or language technology in general, we must keep in mind how the risks and benefits are distributed because they do not accrue to the same people. And while some language technology is generally designed to benefit marginalized communities, most language technology is built to serve the needs of those who already have the most privilege in society. That's one. And then we talk about unfathomable training data. So we have a bunch of sections about how size doesn't guarantee diversity, about how static data doesn't incorporate changing social views, about how bias is encoded, and how curation, documentation, and accountability is important. When we talk about how size doesn't guarantee diversity, we talk about a number of things. One of them is that user-generated content like sites like Reddit, Twitter, and Wikipedia present themselves as open and accessible to anyone, but there are structural factors, including moderation practices, which make them less welcoming to marginalized populations. And these are the sites that are used as training data for these large language models. So then we say the net result is that a limited set of subpopulations can continue to easily add data, sharing their thoughts and developing platforms that are inclusive of their worldviews. This systemic pattern in turn worsens diversity and inclusion within internet-based communication, creating a feedback loop that lessens the impact of data from underrepresented populations. And finally, we talk about some of the risks that follow when we train large language models on that type of data, right? So as people in positions of privilege with the respect to a society's racism, misogyny, ableism, etc., tend to be overrepresented in training data for language models, this training data thus includes encoded biases many already recognize as harmful. And in addition to abusive language and hate speech, there are subtler forms of negativity and various social political framing biases that are prevalent in language data. And so there are more details in our paper. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to cover a couple of examples to show these points. Who benefits from large language models and who pays the cost? And kind of some of the issues with the platforms whose content is used for training data and their moderation practices and how they prevent certain groups of people from participating and how this encodes certain biases. So the day that I was fired, like I said, I was taking a break from driving across the country. I was super stressed out. I was supposed to be on vacation. One of the reasons I needed a vacation was because I was very concerned about escalating war in Ethiopia and the lack of accountability for social media platforms in their role in this war, and I was seeing it happening. ICLR is traditionally held in countries that have discriminatory visa practices towards many groups, including Africans, and last year ICLR would have been held in Ethiopia and Addis Ababa. It does not have discriminatory visa practices, and so it would have allowed for many people to participate. So Ethiopia was a very hopeful country. We're all very excited. On November 3rd, a war broke out. So here is Ethiopia. It is in the Horn of Africa. It has 110 million people. It's the second largest country in Africa, second largest, most populous country. To the north is Ertra, and my parents are from Ertra, so I'm of Eritrean descent. Ertra was colonized by the Italians, and there's a lot of legacy that we hold because of that. And there is a lot happening in Ethiopia right now, but a war was declared in Tigray, and that's the region in the north, and yellow, and that region is being decimated right now. So who benefits from large language models and who pays the cost? Ethiopia is a huge country. It's a country with 86, speaking 86 languages. Only 2 Ethiopian languages are supported by Google Translate, Amharic and Somali. Somali is also spoken in Somalia. Afan Oromo is spoken by Oromo, who are the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia. More than 50 million people, and also in Kenya, is not supported by any of this language technology. Tigrinya, which is spoken by more than 10 million people in Ethiopia and Eritrea, also one of the official languages of Eritrea, not supported. So, like I said, the war was declared on November 3rd. So let's look at the platforms that that are the content generation, the content that is used for training data of large language models. And that comes, a lot of it comes from social media platforms. So these platforms, immediately when the war was declared, there was a flurry of misinformation and fake news. It was so clear that they had no handle on this whatsoever, and it was even unclear if they had any idea what was going on. But at the same time, I think recently I saw this tweet from Jan LeCun, who co-created this conference, right? That says, social media would be guilty if it amplified hate speech and calls to violence. And he also said that 94.7% of hate speech is taken down automatically by AI at Facebook. And I was very surprised by this comment, because first is that, there was a lot of coverage on Facebook's role in Myanmar. And in our own paper, we talk about how, like I said, in social media networks, a limited set of populations can continue to easily add data, sharing their thoughts, and developing platforms that are inclusive of their worldviews, and this is because of their moderation practices. To give you an example of this, many Ethiopian and Eritrean journalists have completely given up on Facebook, and they've migrated to Twitter, and Twitter is still very bad. So for instance, there's all these fake accounts with gang-generated images that are spreading all sorts of propaganda about the war. There is a supposed diplomat that's supposed to be George Bolton, who had a fake account, fake face, and whatever he said was getting amplified by accounts with more than 1 million followers, etc. And there's a bunch of other examples here of fake accounts with gang-generated images. Nothing was done about these accounts in any of these social media platforms. A lot of journalists are put in lists to be hacked and attacked, and every time they post on one of these platforms, there's a lot of, a flood of fake accounts or other paid people who comment who, in a certain way. They harass them. There are people with burner accounts who send them death threats. And so there's been a proliferation of fake news in addition to this targeted harassment. And there's a lot of research that talks about targeted harassment towards journalists. So the ethical AI team members, our team members hail from many different countries. And our paper was written by people with connections to at least 4 continents and different demographics and disciplines. And so a couple of weeks before I got fired, we hired El Mahdi, who is of Moroccan origin. And he co-founded a media outlet in Morocco before working on his PhD. And many journalists, for example, Omar Radi, are currently jailed and harassed in Morocco, like many other places. And those who advocate on their behalf are similarly harassed and intimidated. And one of the ways that this intimidation is done is through social media platforms. So, for instance, Mahdi received death threats because of his advocacy for journalists. Here's an example of that. So the photo says, if you cross the lines, your existence ends. But Twitter said this did not violate their terms of service, right? And we write in our paper that there are multiple cases where people on the receiving end of death threats on Twitter have had their accounts suspended, while accounts issuing the death threats persist. These are the platforms that we're using, our training data, that are preventing certain groups of people from participating freely and proliferating other types of content. They also write that harassment on Twitter is experienced by a wide range of overlapping groups, including domestic abuse victims, sex workers, trans people, queer people, immigrants, medical patients, neurodivergent people, and visibly or vocally disabled people. So journalists is one of the groups that I discussed earlier. I want to give another example. So here's Truth TV, which is, this is the most popular YouTube channel in Morocco. It has more than 4 billion views. This is their Facebook account. It's followed by more than 20 million people, and 20 million people is about as many Moroccans as there are on Facebook. So this is a very, they have a huge audience. Now, in February 2021, there was this report from Facebook talking about the inauthentic behavior, the coordinated accounts that they took down. So they said they removed 385 Facebook accounts. And they said the people behind this network of fake accounts also frequently use these accounts to comment on news and pro-government stories from various news outlets including Truth TV. 385 is a very low number compared to findings from independent researchers. I can't name their names right now, but they'll come up with a report. And these numbers are closer to 15,000 accounts, not 385 that Facebook is saying. So even Facebook, when they're doing these kinds of investigations, they're not taking down, the number of accounts that exist. They're taking down a small number of them. There are a lot of profiles harassing jailed journalists, engaging in promoting content from Truth TV, and they have image of the king and the head of intelligence, and the latter is accused of torture, and the French authorities sent a warrant against him. So the channel has done many things, and I want to give you a few examples. And this is to show you examples of channels that are being condoned and proliferated in these social media platforms that are causing a lot of harm and harassment in places other than the U.S. within languages other than English. So this channel posted a pornographic montage on its Facebook and YouTube channels of a policewoman and her American daughter, and according to the mother's testimony, these videos were secretly recorded in a hotel. This was done to blackmail her in order to push her to remove her lawsuit against the high-ranking police official she accuses of sexual abuse. So this was posted on Truth TV, a YouTube channel. When the blackmail didn't work, she was smeared directly on YouTube and Facebook. And this time a video was edited to put, instead of her daughter's image, a naked image of a policewoman's lawyer. And this was the only lawyer who would agree to represent her, because a lot of people are afraid of retaliation. There's testimonies of people who tried to sue this channel in Morocco and failed, and most lawyers refused to help them because they know that the law will be against this, very powerful channel. They also published Karima Nadir's child's birth certificate, and she is a privacy activist and single mother. This was done to bully the child, and kids in his middle school received a copy of that birth certificate through WhatsApp. Nadir published a video saying the birth certificate is a secret document that can only be obtained by authorities. So there's many stories like this that lead most credible human rights organizations to publicly declare that Truth TV is the Moroccan Secret Services Agency's YouTube channel. And independent researchers working on this topic have collected testimonials of YouTubers receiving for years daily threats of anal torture and jail if they go back to Morocco. And many Moroccan YouTubers have already been jailed. Researchers witnessed these threats firsthand by attending many of these victims' live streams. They saw in real time the massive flow of threats that they receive. In March, a group of women survivors, including this journalist, Hajar Rasuni, who was jailed and put through a forced gynecological examination by a doctor, under the orders of the authorities, organized a Facebook live stream. So this was supposed to be a live stream on Facebook. She was planning to deliver what was going to be her full testimony for the first time. And the live stream was just flooded by these profiles of fake women telling her she's a liar. So imagine if an American channel did a fraction of the violations this TV channel has committed so far, YouTube channel has committed so far, Facebook page has committed so far. It would have been suspended, like what was done with Alex Jones's InfoWars. So this is just an example. It's just the tip of the iceberg. But this is an example I wanted to show on what happens to the countries that are not considered important and how these companies and these platforms are doing nothing. YouTube and Facebook have taken zero action on Truth TV. So when I see the statement, 94% of hate speech is taken down automatically by AI, I don't understand this statement. I don't get it. Here's another example. Content moderation is very complex. It already has a lot of issues. And so Maliha Ahmed and Alex Hanna have this short, really great talk about it. But in addition to all of these issues, these companies are also infiltrated by different agents. So here's one example. So Twitter bots have been implicated in crimes, actual crimes, like the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi. And a British newspaper revealed that Saudi journalist had died under torture in his country, after Twitter Dubai's office allegedly disclosed his identity to the kingdom's authorities. So this journalist, Turki bin Abdulaziz Al Jazeera, he allegedly ran a Twitter account, and so this exposed human rights violations by Saudi authorities and royals. And he was arrested on March 15, 2018, and died while being tortured in detention. So, according to this report, Saudi authorities were able to identify him thanks to information shared by Twitter's Dubai office, which was accused of involvement in spying on the accounts of Saudi dissidents. So, to recap, these platforms and what they're doing here, this is what we're using to train data for large language models. Certain groups of people can't participate in these platforms. They're harassed. They are bullied off of these platforms. These platforms are a breeding ground for abusive language, harassment, and hate speech, proliferating harmful content. And in return, work on large language models does not focus on any of these countries, languages, or people for which these platforms are causing the aforementioned issues. So I want to now finally move to point 3. What the research community must do, or what I think we can do. So the Abuse and Misogyny Playbook tells us that there is a playbook, but if we are able to identify the playbook, then we can break out of the playbook. The first step is to identify that there is a playbook. So they say, as should be clear by now, this cycle of abuse of Black women is not new. Dr. Gebru's story is not so much personal as it is a playbook, a classic example of how those in power cannot make space for truth bearers when the truth threatens the very basis of their power. The playbook is plucked right from history, as we have shown by the stories of Ida B. Wells, Phyllis Wheatley, Harriet Jacobs, and Zora Neale Hurston. The playbook continues to be wielded today. So what do I want to say? Do not dismiss works led by Black women and members of other marginalized communities. Most people will do that and then say it's not because of the race, it's not because of the sex. Be cognizant of that. If you yourself are working on fairness from your gaze, from your point of view, while suppressing other people's voices and points of view, it's exploitation. Understand and value different types of expertise, and don't both sides and hedge your bet. Take a clear stand when you see injustice. So they say we call on the AI ethics community to take responsibility for rooting out white supremacy and sexism in our community, as well as to eradicate their downstream effects and data products. Without this baseline in place, all other calls for AI ethics ring hollow and smack of DEI tokenism. And what this work begins is by recognizing and interrupting the playbook, along with the institutional apparatus that works to disbelieve, dismiss, gaslight, discredit, silence, and erase the leadership of Black women. So I want to give one example I just saw recently. So when I say you yourself working on quote-unquote fairness from your gaze while suppressing other people's voices is exploitation, I just saw this photo and caption shared by some prominent members of this community very recently, and I just immediately cringed just seeing this image. I'm very familiar, growing up in Ethiopia, I'm very familiar of images like this with a white person surrounded by kids or whatever, African kids, mostly. Not just that, but the caption was also not, I don't have a lot of time to discuss all the issues, but talks about these primitive African tribe who have this word Ubuntu, and, even though they're primitive, they still share everything, and their heart is pure, but us, we've transcended all of this and all of that, Anyways, what could you have done instead? What could you have done instead of sharing this photo and caption from the gaze of a white anthropologist man? That already, the history of anthropologists in this continent is already extremely problematic. You could have shared the works of Black women, Black people in general, Africans in general from that community who talk about that community. You could understand and value different types of expertise. For instance, there is Ababa Berhane, who is from Ethiopia, but who talks about Ubuntu philosophy. She has a paper called Towards a Relational Ethics. Sabelo Malambi is another one. So you could have shared their works. They talk about their communities and their philosophies. So you could share works from their gaze rather than from yours. So this is basically what people at Google did to me. They looked at our work from our gaze and our perspective, and they said, this is below the bar, this is not okay. Even though it passed peer review and everything, obviously it was accepted for an academic paper. But after that, they could write whatever paper they wanted, right? They wrote a follow-up paper, just put it up on archive. The people who retracted my paper approved their paper. So, and then they followed the playbook to attempt to discredit us. Another thing I would say is follow the students. Students are at the forefront of all movements, in my opinion, especially undergrads. And there needs to be some amount of accountability. Academic conferences, academics need to work on holding institutions accountable. So there is this organization, No Tech for Tyrants, that has this Recruit Me Not campaign. They have this petition. The Google Walkout has this Make AI Ethical campaign that has a list of action items. And I just found out about this students creating this Justice for Timnit t-shirt. And they're like just going to go to class with all of these t-shirts because faculty at Stanford, my alma mater, are quiet. They're hedging their bets. They don't know what's right to say, what's good for their career. That's what I mean by don't hedge your bets, take a clear stand. And Ruth Starkman, who's a great lecturer, she is paying for this out of pocket. And I'm hoping that if there are any proceeds whatsoever, that we can donate or contribute to women who, there are many of them who go through what I go through, but don't have any safety nets. So in the Google Walkout Make AI Ethical campaign, they have a few suggestions. So one of them is that academic conferences should require papers from submitting organizations to supply publication approval policies and refuse to review papers that have been subjected to editing by lawyers or similar corporate representatives. What do I mean by that? Here's another example. Nicholas Carlini and collaborators wrote a paper on memorization of large language models, and they were required to omit results. They had lots of required edits, so this is an article in Reuters. They had to change concerns to considerations. They were told to omit some references about how, it leaked copyright content. They had to remove words breach and sensitive. And so Nicholas said, let's be clear. When we as academics write that we have a concern or find something worrying and a Google lawyer requires that we changed it to sound nicer, this is very much Big Brother stepping in. And Big Brother is very much stepping in, and they're using the same, once again, playbook as Big Tobacco. So here is this paper, The Gray Hoodie Project, Big Tobacco, Big Tech, and the Threat on Academic Integrity. They say how Big Tech can actively distort the academic landscape to suit its needs. By comparing the well-studied actions of another industry, Big Tobacco, to the current actions of Big Tech, we see similar strategies employed by both industries. These strategies enable either industry to sway and influence academic and public discourse. What is the responsibility of conferences like ICLR? Is it for them to allow these industries to sway and influence academic and public discourse? Because if you just publish these papers without any requirements, then you're not publishing academic papers. You're publishing the uncensored papers, and that becomes propaganda. Finally, I think we all need to advocate for labor laws, whistleblower protection, and anti-discrimination laws. People might think this is not connected to research, but it is. In order to do real research, we need to not retaliate against researchers that just do their work. Workers need to build power. As I mentioned, it's not about intentions, it's about who has power. And multinational tech companies have too much power and they need to be regulated. Again, this is not about intentions. This is about the amount of impact that they have and that we are currently at their whim. So finally, I want to say thank you to members of the Ethical AI team who have taught me so much. And there's many of them here. I don't think I talked about Emily or Dylan. or Jamie or Andrew or Madeline, but I have learned a lot from this team, and I still consider them my team. And I think that's it. I have a video that I can show if we have time, but I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Haldame, and I'm thrilled to be here moderating the first keynote Q&A with Dr. Timnit Gebru. As a reminder, we want all of these sessions to be interactive, so please post your questions for Timnit in Rocket Chat, and I will do my best to get them all to her. So as a bit of background quickly about myself, I'm a professor at the University of Maryland and also a researcher at Microsoft Research in New York. I actually met Timnit for the first time at Microsoft Research when she was a postdoc there. At the time, there was an effort that Timnit had started on this data sheets for datasets project with colleagues Jamie Morgenstern, Brianna Vecchioni, Jen Wortman-Vaughan, Hannah Wallach, and Kate Crawford. And one of the things that Timnit talks about in the talk that you all just watched is this importance of valuing work by people who have different backgrounds and disciplinary skills and stuff like that. And I thought this was like a great sort of starter project for me in that space because it was like this really amazing breadth of people with lots of different areas of expertise. So I'm very excited to be here again with Timnit to have this conversation. She talked a lot about her background in the talk, so I'm not going to do a full bio, but just so we're all sort of on the same page where she's coming from. She went to Stanford for both her bachelor's and master's degrees and returned there for her PhD following some time working on signal processing at Apple. During her PhD, among other things, she developed algorithms to estimate demographics of US neighborhoods based on Google Street View images. This work won the competition at the LDV Capital Vision Summit in 2017. She spent 2 years as a postdoc at Microsoft Research in New York City, and then co-led the ethics team in AI at Google Research until last December, as you all know. With Joy Buolamwini, she authored the Gender Shades paper, and her work on biometric bias, also with Joy and Deb Raji, won VentureBeat's 2019 AI Innovations Award in the category of AI for Social Good. And together with Ready at a Baby, she founded Black in AI, which has had a tremendous amount of impact on our entire community and has also been a tremendous amount of work for Timnit and the other organizers. So with that, I'd like to just say, hi, Timnit, welcome. We're thrilled to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, you know, I only spent 1 year at MSR. Feels like a long time. It was a very, I think it was a transformational 1 year.
Oh, sorry. I got that wrong. I should have checked that.
And I spent that year with you.
Yes, I know. I thought that you had started before I got there, but I guess we came at about the same time.
Yeah.
So one thing I found really impressive about your talk is how you weave together these topics like misinformation, death threats against journalists, climate change, the war in Ethiopia, large language models, and technical topics that you know, we all think about all the time. And I think, you know, there's a lot of work in academia that sort of ignores or pretends that there's not a connection between these things. But like one of the messages that really stood out to me in your talk and also in the Stochastic Parrots paper is that these things really are connected. And that, you know, we can't really talk about fairness or ethics and AI and if we ignore them. So can you say a little bit about how these topics connect for you?
Yeah, you know, I tried to do this, and then initially my talk was 54 minutes. Then I cut it down 48 minutes. Then we took out a chunk, and now it's 40 minutes. And so in this version, we took out some key parts. So I was talking about, for instance, refugees, Eritrea, and climate. So we took out this part in this because there wasn't enough time. But I guess I would say that that is part of valuing lived experience. So for instance, I gave an example from Mahdi, right, who was in our team. Well, I guess he was reporting to me, and then he was reporting to Meg, you know. So, but his interest was theoretical computer science. He was working on robustness and stuff like that. But he started working on misinformation literally out of necessity. Out of necessity because he couldn't, others weren't doing anything about it, and it was his life and and his friend's life and his family's life. So he started spending a whole chunk of time on that, and I started learning a lot from that research. So that, I guess for me, that all of those connections happen because of your lived experience and the other disciplines and other people that you're around. And that was one of the things we wanted to do in the paper, is because when you talk about risks from a specific point of view, you already kind of make an assumption about what risks you think are important versus not. And so then your point of view matters, because some people might not think environmental racism is a big deal. Some people might say, our data centers are carbon neutral, so we can use however number of resources we want, but there is a limited number of resources in the world, right? So so that's what I mean. That's kind of what I want to, I guess, the message that I want to send is that when you talk about risks, who is talking about them is really important, because unless you're impacted by it, you're really not really going to understand. So like the statement about hate speech being taken down and stuff, for us it's personal, because I didn't talk about it in this talk, but the harassment I outlined, against journalists, etc., by coordinated attacks and fake accounts and all of that, it was happening to me, right? Like right after I got fired, it was all happening to me, and I was like, I don't have time to study all this, but I would if I had a chance. And accounts weren't suspended, and there was this one guy whose account was suspended, but he still has a burner account. He's still stalking me. He might even be here. I don't know. There's stuff like that. So I think that's just the take-home message for me, is that you have to start centering the voices of the people who are most impacted, because that's the only time when we really start to understand the issues and the risks.
Yeah, that
I
makes
don't
a
know
lot
if
of
I answered your question.
No,
That's that's kind of what I want to, I guess, the take-home message.
Yeah, no, that's perfect, and it connects a bit to a question from the chat by Alex Hernandez Garcia, who sort of points out that corporations like Google, Facebook, others tend to have orthogonal interests to those of science or people who strive for an equitable society, and they recognize this as a potentially major problem. So I think the question is as a research community, like how should we be thinking about dealing with organizations, whether they're companies or otherwise, whose aims may be not super aligned with what we might want?
Well, okay, so I'm going to try to have a short version of this answer, because I can go on for an hour. But so one thing I want to say is that sometimes people talk about academic freedom, and they're like, well, you're in a corporation, so obviously you're not going to have academic freedom. You should go to academia, but academia does not have academic freedom. Like, it only has that for just a couple of people, and everybody else is sort of like an indentured servant who's too scared about, the next career. If they're a postdoc and they don't make the advisor happy, they're not going to get a letter, and so therefore their career is ruined. If you're on a visa or something, you can be in a very harmful environment. So a lot of grad students are starting to unionize, which I think is great. But so I think this whole issue of academic integrity and labor kind of power, it's beyond, I think, the industry versus the academia dichotomy. And the underlying paradigm that I have an issue with pervades both. So if you look at ICLR, right, everybody's friends, everybody's colleagues, people have been working together for 30 years or whatever. So now just because your collaborator is at Google or Facebook or something, and you're in academia, you're not going to really hold them accountable, because everything is so intertwined, So that's one thing. The other thing I would say is, so there was that book, right? I mean, not book, I call it a book. It's 40-page paper, it's not a book, but the moral character of cryptographic work, right? Where Philip, is it Rothway? He's a cryptographer, I believe, and he outlines, you know, how physicists were active in nuclear disarmament, and all the physics researchers, right? I mean, they all had to reckon with what they were involved in and what they did, like Oppenheimer and a number of other people, right? So he outlines how, you know, physicists had to be active in nuclear disarmament, and then he writes that he thinks that the fact that mass surveillance couldn't be stopped, he thinks it's a fault of the cryptographic community and how they conduct their research and stuff. So I highly recommend that people read that paper. But so we have, as researchers, we have, I think, a responsibility to at least, as a conference, when you have a conference, have procedures in place that don't encourage, that discourage certain kinds of behavior, right? So if you have a paper like Nicholas Cotley's paper that's been edited out to you know, to have a different kind of view of reality versus what they originally wanted to write, then that means we're engaged in propaganda for these companies, right? And so we need to, academic communities need to push back. They need to be the ones, in my opinion, that are pushing back. And I've been extremely disappointed because, for instance, in the fight against face recognition, you know, face surveillance, we didn't see a single academic community, you know, writing letters or anything. It was just like a few of us sort of fighting, and there was civic communities, and then the company said they're abandoning it before any academic community said anything. And I would have thought that the academic community could have started some of this movement, right? So that's sort of, you know, what I would say about that. And in terms of their incentives being orthogonal, of course, like if the incentive is just to make money, they'll do it at whatever cost, right? So auto companies' incentives was not to create safe cars. It was to just, you know, like spend as little amount of money as possible on manufacturing cars that sold as much as possible, right? We wrote this in our data sheets paper, which, like, the first couple of versions of our data sheets paper, right, which we took out later, but the regulation and the safety, etc., came over 100 years, and they were still fighting it. They weren't just like, oh yeah, sure, let's just do this. So the tech industry, in my opinion, is at that level. If they spent as many resources as are required on fighting fake news and misinformation, they would not nearly make as much profit margins as they are right now. Nearly. So they will never do it unless they're forced to. All of this labor about uncovering Facebook and coordination misinformation, that's coming from victims who already are victims of these platforms. It's not coming from, you know, it's not being initiated by the platform. So we have to force them, by we I mean research community, legislation, etc., to do the right thing, because obviously, yes, it is orthogonal to, you know, what they're incentivized to do right now.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. One of the questions that came in from Anmol Chhabria is actually kind of similar to something I wanted to ask about, which is, you know, how we think about navigating the construction of these large language models. So, you know, you give a bunch of examples of how the development of such models is actively harming people, especially people who are just not at all benefiting from this technology development, which sort of suggests, well, I don't know, work on those languages, or, you know, work on problems faced by people in those areas. But then, like, we also see, like, I'm reminded of a paper that came out from the Masakane project, where they're basically, like, blindly crawling data from languages you don't know anything about causes more harm than good. And then a talk by
I love that community. The Masakane community. It's amazing. Sorry.
It's super amazing. No, and then, like, I was also going to give a shout out to Keone Mahalona and Peter Lucas Jones at the Indigenous and AI workshop, who also talk about developing technologies that people don't want in, like, their local communities. And so this seems to create a tension between, you know, building technology that may help people, but then, you know, it having the opposite effect.
You know, the thing is, the reason I wanted to write this paper is because I wanted certain perspectives to be heard. And initially, I wasn't even going to write this paper. I asked Emily if she had a paper, Emily and Bender, because linguists have been think about this a lot more than, you know, people in the deep learning community or something like that in general. I found they have had, you know, years and years and years of experience thinking about these issues. So that is the perspective I wanted to bring forward, in addition to perspective of people like Mark Diaz, for instance, who's done research on different platforms and how they affect people in different communities. So the first thing I would say is that, you know, when we analyze the risk, so this paths forward we have in our paper, it's not like we have all the solutions, right? When we wrote Gender Shades with Joy, we weren't like, and then here is the solution to everything. You know, years later, there's still kind of follow-up work and one aspect of this, another aspect of this. But one thing that came to the fore, even in that paper, is here is an issue, and here's why we think that this issue might exist. So in that case, we were talking about who was represented in the web, whose faces were represented, who was considered a celebrity, because a lot of people use faces of celebrities to train face recognition type and automated facial analysis type tools. But then at the same time, it wasn't something that really covered in the paper, but even if you don't have disparities in error rates across subpopulations in terms of face recognition, even if it works perfectly, there are still going to be issues, right? Because of who it's being used against. And the people organizing against that are the people who it's being used against, like in Detroit, you know, Tawana Petty. So mostly Black and brown people in the U.S. So I think this is sort of an analog to that. The very first answer is just listen to the people who are being impacted the most. Don't shut that down like you just didn't. You know, I was like, don't. You know, we worked hard to create an academic conference that we could actually publish these kinds of works, right? Then now there's an academic conference, we submitted to it, and then we were, you know, sort of shut down. So don't do that. Listen to, you know, people in different communities that are impacted. But the problem is that they don't have power, so you don't have to listen to them right now. So like Rhea Kaluri wrote this article in Nature, you know, ask how AI shifts power. Every time we build technology, we have to ask, is this technology shifting power, or is it not? Is it just amplifying people's need? I mean, the privilege of currently powerful people, and the people who can answer that mostly are the currently not powerful people. So honestly, to be honest, I don't think we can any longer depend on the intentions of people who are powerful, because they don't have to listen. And so we have to figure out how we can, you know, amplify the voices of people who are not in power and give them some amount of power.
Yeah, that connects actually very nicely to a question by Sandeep Silwal, who asks, you know, how can we avoid this bystander effect in academia where everyone knows, quote unquote, the right thing to do, but individuals are afraid of retaliation, right? Like, you gave the postdoc letter, or like, am I going to get hired by this company, or whatever, right? And so, like, yeah, what can we do about this?
Well, so without working on institutional change, it's very difficult to ask individuals to sacrifice their careers or take the fall. So we have to work on institutional change. So some things that I've been seeing, I mean, maybe related or not, one of the issues was that data-related work is not considered great in conferences, right? You submit a data set paper, and they're like, oh yeah, this is just like data, where's the algorithm, you know? So that's the kind of reviews you get. But then what we're saying is we're asking people to spend a lot of time on data annotation collection processes, thinking through things. So now at NEARS, there's going to be a data track, right? So that's a good first step. Because if you're going to ask people to spend a lot of time on data-related stuff, but then they're going to be punished for it, that doesn't make any sense. So if we're going to ask them to do that, we're going to have to make the institutional changes that allow them to do that. If we're going to ask people not to take money for corporations, there needs to be an alternative. There needs to be an alternative so that they can take money from a different institution, right? So that's the thing. We should all work through institutional changes. So for me, like building worker power is one of those. So if a grad student, you know, doesn't have any power whatsoever, you're at the mercy of your advisor. So maybe, you know, depending on letters from advisors is not the best thing to do. Maybe we should have a different kind of way of evaluating people, you know what I mean? So that they're not beholden to this one person. Same with postdocs or something like that. So, and unionization, I think, is one of those. I mean, it's not a silver bullet, I'll say, but so we have to think through how do we build worker power so that people have negotiating power. Because otherwise, you can't just go tell people and be like, hey, yeah, like, you be a saint. You take the fall, I'll be okay. I mean, we can't be doing that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I can totally understand how this puts everyone in a difficult position if there's sort of nothing to fall back on.
But there is strength in numbers, is what I would say. And so that's kind of what we tried to do at Google. We had like this little coalition where we were usually trying to advocate for each other together.
Yeah, I think this idea of, sort of having a group of people that can work on these things together is helpful. And I guess, once you're one of the, at least in academia, people who have tenure, you're at least somewhat protected, although, things like funding and stuff like that, I think this is one of the weird things about academia. It's like, no matter how high up you get in the sort of like power hierarchy, there's always, everyone's rejudging you, and it can be very hard to take a stand.
Yeah, you need to get to the next level. And so now you don't want to rock the boat because then you won't get to the next level. And so again, yeah, it's about, so the prior question about institutional, oh, we can feel free to run over. Oh, sorry, I was like rushing to, well then, okay, I will relax. So I'm just joking. The prior question about the incentives of these companies, right, that they are orthogonal. So then that means we have to change the incentives of these companies to not be orthogonal. There's no way. So one thing I had in my talk, in my 54-minute version that I took out, was exactly that, the incentive. So I was talking about the fired five, the Thanksgiving fired five. A year after they fired them, I'm sorry, the day they fired me, the National Labor Relations Board came out and said that they filed a complaint I don't know what it's called, like that they shouldn't have been fired. They shouldn't, but now there is a complaint, then there means that a trial will happen, and if when they win the trial, Google will have to reinstate them. So imagine, they fire you, and then they use the same thing that they said about Meg, something about security, blah blah blah. They say stuff about you, so you might not even be hired other places. It's a smear campaign. 1 year later, the NLRB says there's a complaint, and then God knows how long later, like maybe 1 year, they might be required to reinstate you. By that time, you're like exhausted. You've been, you might even give up. Are you even going to want to go? So what incentive does Google have to do anything differently? And then if they lose, they have to pay like $2 million to 100 people. So each person gets like $500. So what incentive does the person have to fight? Because they ruin your life. I mean, Chelsea Glasson has been going on for 3 years on pregnancy discrimination. And what incentive does the company have to do anything differently? Because the regulation is not really punishing them. So if we want change, we have to advocate for a different incentive. And I think that comes from strengthening. First of all, there's already laws that can be strengthened in the U.S. And in terms of misinformation, at this point, I personally honestly think, because I'm seeing how they don't do anything with these coordinated attacks and stuff, and people are getting bullied off of these platforms, and the online harm leads to offline harm too. There's many examples of that. I don't have time right now. I honestly think that there needs to be these massive lawsuits on these platforms that they can then, start being afraid of or something. Because right now, it's very harmful, and we don't really have a recourse. So I guess my take-home message is we do have to work on institutional changes to change that incentive structure. Otherwise, and so that's why I was also talking about what ICLR can do as a conference, because if you don't change the incentive, because there is an incentive for companies to publish, saying, oh yeah, we published this many papers, we're like this, but if there isn't an incentive for them to change, some of their practice in some way, we can't expect change.
Yeah, so on this topic of, what can academics and conferences and stuff like that do, so there's one axis of, sort of marginalized groups that you talked about. There's also sort of this other axis, this is brought up by Naila Murray, about academic and research disciplines that are marginalized within our discussions that maybe should have a place in ICLR,
yes.
But don't. So who are they? Like who should we be reaching
actually,
out to?
somebody asked in the chat, is there older disciplines that that we can learn from? And I said I have a paper with a historian called Lessons from Archives, that we wrote from archives. Now, so I talked a little bit about anthropology in my talk, but so Ali Al-Khatib writes, I think he has a blog post, I think it's called Anthropological AI. So he was an anthropologist and then, an HCI later. But so anthropology is a field that has a very problematic history, right? This one one group, recently there's like using the remains. Anyway, I don't know. Like so I'm just not gonna go into it. But one group of people, quote unquote, studying another group of people, and in a very dehumanizing way. Just like lots of issues, right? And those issues started coming to the fore, and the community has had to discuss it and stuff. Not that it's fixed whatsoever, but this is a discussion and writings that had to happen. And archival history, same thing. They've been gathering data for a long time, and so some of the issues that arise from this field, they have language to discuss them, and there's just it's at least there's a forum to try to work on them. So those are specific two specific areas, right? I have another talk that I gave a while back called The Hierarchy of Knowledge, which is exactly this in machine learning and its effects. Certain types of knowledge are way low in the hierarchy, and again, if you have all the money, you don't have to listen to anybody. That's the problem. Like in computer science, they say, okay, interdisciplinary, blah blah blah. They don't have to listen to anthropology. They don't have to listen to history. They don't have to listen to race and gender studies, because they have all the money. They're bringing in all the money. They're creating all these companies and like all the power. So whatever these other disciplines say, you don't have to listen. So I think the problem is, like, yes, there's this hierarchy of knowledge that other disciplines will tell you, but being at the mercy of our good intentions is just not going to work, because you're not going to be inconvenienced if there's no incentives because you have the power. That's what I've seen over and over again. I try to appeal to people with power, and then it just doesn't work, So what needs to happen is now these disciplines need to be elevated up so that they have some amount of power. So at least in the U.S., Alondra Nelson, she's a deputy now at the Office of Science and Technology, I believe. I don't know what P stands for. It's OSTP. So she now has a lot of power to scrutinize tech companies and how they're affecting society. And she's a sociologist. That's what I think needs to happen. So now you have to listen to her. Before, you might have not even known her name. You might have not even seen her writings. So these people in other disciplines need to be elevated up.
So now I think we are running out of time, unfortunately.
Okay.
I would be happy if we were told you could go another 10 minutes. But maybe we can close with one question. You've mentioned a lot of things that we can all do, like papers to read, things to look at, things that conferences can do. In terms of your own work, like what's the one thing you're like most excited about right now?
Well, excitement is interesting. I'm sort of recovering, but we have Lynn Champy, who is a Stanford. She's graduating now, a PhD student. She came up with this proposal for a research institute called Black Air, that centers the needs of Black women in their communities and kind of ideas from that perspective, because it's always varied. So I'm like trying to see how I can help with that. And so that's super exciting. Every time I work on stuff like that, I'm really energized and excited, and people don't understand I'm like unemployed but spending like hours on stuff like that. So they're like, what are you doing? You're not supposed to have a job right now. So that's what I'm excited about. And I'm excited about, there's a paper that a student, Raseja Safala, who's from South Africa, has been working on for years. Like, we started it in 2017 on spatial apartheid in South Africa, and we were analyzing satellite imagery to understand the evolution of spatial apartheid in South Africa. And it's finally sort of coming together, and I'm super excited about that too.
That's wonderful. I actually remember talking about that project years ago.
I know. I feel like people think like I'm just, lying or something, but I just talk about this project for like years, and they're like, "Is this really happening?" But it is. It is. It's just a lot of work. Data-related work is a lot. You spend 3 years working on the data, and then 2 months or 3 months on everything else, and you can only publish on everything else. That just doesn't make sense to me. But anyways, yeah, I'm excited about that.
Yeah, I am also. So with that, we'll close. I want to give a big thank you to Nikhil Kruthi and Ali Alavi, who've helped run this session, feeding questions to us and so on, to the ICLR organizers for inviting Dr. Gebru, and of course to Timnit herself for this session and for all her extraordinary research and also service to our community. So thank you, Timnit.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.